Thank you very much. And can I first of all thank the organisers for inviting me to speak here today. As you've heard, I have been working on long COVID for a while. My background is, I think, like quite a few of the, say, older people in the audience, a background in HIV, the other big infectious disease epidemiology occupation of the last few decades. Today, I've been asked to talk about the gaps. Now, the gaps is a very, it's a broad topic, and so I've got quite a lot of freedom as to what I'm going to talk about. And there are many experts who are going to talk about more specific aspects later in the conference. So I'm going to I'm sort of standing back a little bit and looking about what we know, what we don't know, what the challenges are, really. I hope not to repeat what has already been said, and just to look at what we can think about and prioritise going forwards. Millions of people continue to struggle with the after effects of COVID-19 infection, and some of them have been struggling with those for nearly 4 years now. The first recognition and naming of long COVID was by patients, not initially by clinicians, although some of those patients were themselves clinicians. And this was a quote from a paper by Felicity Callard and Elisa Perego. It was published in 2021, who said that long COVID has a strong claim to be they're considered the first illness to be collectively made by patients who found each other through Twitter and other social media. That early association with social media has persisted, and many of the groups that have supported this conference and ongoing long COVID support groups are predominantly online support groups. So, in reference to that, I suppose, and in preparing for this talk, I used some of my own social media links with these groups to ask what people with lived experience of long COVID, first of all, what they think the main gaps are. So that's my starting point. So I'd like to thank Long COVID Support, Long COVID Kids, Long COVID Action Project and Long COVID Advocacy, and numerous individuals who replied to me on Facebook and Twitter, or rather X as we should now call it. This word cloud is from the responses that they had and shows some of the common issues raised. And you will see if this, it's very slow, isn't it? Anyway, you can see it, I don't need to point. The common issues were treatment, trials, PROMs, which is patient-reported outcome measures, support, biomarkers, fatigue. And reading through the many responses, 4 themes really emerged that I wanted to reflect on. I know there's a lot of text on here, but I'll explain what I have thought. The first theme I have called shift from counting to intervention. And it was based particularly on this comment from a patient advisor that we work closely with. And she said, I would like less effort in trying to figure out if the prevalence is 5% or 10% or whatever, and for us to accept that it's already too much. We need to concentrate on figuring out how to help the millions of people who currently need it. And I know, as somebody who has spent a lot of time trying to figure out how common and counting how many people have got long COVID, I think there's a really strong point there that we perhaps have moved beyond that being the primary question. However, it is important to track who gets long COVID and to try and identify how common it is. And to see how much that's being added to, because as we're getting more and more waves of SARS-CoV-2 going through the populations, and maybe at lower rates, long COVID is still developing. So we do need to continue to do that, but we need to also move on. The second point strongly made was the need for diagnostics and objective measures, and we've obviously heard ways of trying to address that in the last talk. To my mind, that is at the heart of most of the gaps that we're going to talk about, the lack of an objective measure of who has and who has not got long COVID. The lack of a set of agreed criteria for diagnosis leads to so many problems. As this person says in the top, oh no, not that one, this, diagnostics is the most important. There's too much shrugging of shoulders by doctors, i.e. doctors who can't find anything, so they don't believe you, they don't know whether you've got anything wrong. And there's a lot of cynicism in clinicians, but also more generally in society, about whether or not long COVID exists and who has it, and whether it's a real condition. We do have definitions. We have WHO definitions, CDC definitions, NICE in the UK have definitions, but they are very difficult to operationalise in clinical practice or to use for eligibility for trials. Our own research includes a qualitative study interviewing people who meet the WHO criteria for long COVID, but many of them don't know whether they would call themselves long COVID patients and have not sought help. And there's a poster on this later on in the conference by my colleague Emily Cooper, who's here. The second comment in this second bit is the need for subtyping. Unless we can distinguish between different types of post-COVID sequelae, we're not going to be able to have precise understandings of mechanisms and therefore not going to have precise treatments. The second major theme from patients, well, the second group, the third theme was actually treatment. One response was simply treatment, asked what the gaps were. For some people who have been suffering for many years with a quite debilitating illness, this is their highest priority. But you cannot unpick that from the last point about the lack of clarity on precision of diagnosis and the failure to identify a single mechanism. We'll come on to more about mechanistic understandings of the pathogenesis, but at the moment there is no considered and accepted view on that. Also, people talked about specific things that they wanted investigation and treatment for, even if it was symptomatic treatment rather than a cure. And the particular and common ones were, and I think this relates to what Andreas just said, that post-exertional malaise, mast cell activation and dysautonomia, postural tachycardia syndromes, and cognitive problems being the priorities for a lot of patients. The second, or the comment here that says you could mention the God of the gaps, which wasn't one that I've actually heard before. I thought was a good way of putting it. That the situation when a lack of scientific understanding leads to people believing in a supernatural deity was the origin of it, but leads to the gaps being filled, as it says here, by pseudoscience, psychosocial theory, and this has led to gaps. Now, I don't agree that psychosocial is necessarily pseudoscience, because psychological and social factors have a huge impact on the risks of and experience of disease. But I do agree that where there is a lack of clear diagnosis, clear pathogenesis, and clear treatment, people are vulnerable and go and try all sorts of remedies that they either read about on the internet, it's trial and error, self-experimentation. The final theme from the patient point of view was recognition and education. It's probably, this person said, it's of most importance to me. Very few professionals know about long COVID. My nephrologist doesn't even believe in it. And that is a terrible thing for a patient. And people talk about gaslighting, i.e. people don't believe them. They've been really unwell, or they've got very particular symptoms they didn't have before, and yet they're told, well, you know, we can't find anything wrong. All the tests come back normal. This leads to more shrugging of shoulders. And even where there is information available, I think there was a question earlier about tachycardia and those syndromes. There are treatments for things like that, but people are not getting access to them because people don't believe that they've got a condition. So if these are the major themes from patients, I thought I'd also look back at whether we've made much progress. As I say, I've been working in this area for about 3 years now. And in 2021, I was invited to write a commentary in The Lancet on optimizing clinical management of long COVID and key priorities as research emerges. And I worked with some colleagues at Imperial, some patient advisors, and colleagues in Peru and Singapore. This article actually appeared, it's a very short article, exactly 2 years ago in the first week of December 2021. So has there been any progress? It was a little bit depressing, I have to say, reading this, rereading this. I did look, and there's been over 4,000 articles listed on PubMed since then that have long COVID in the title or in the abstract, and over 20,000 if you use the synonyms for long COVID. However, I think most of the gaps that we identified and the priorities we identified then do remain. So 2 years ago, what did we say? So the key challenges that we identified were the lack of health professional consensus, definition or nomenclature, and poor understanding of pathophysiology. We put that also in the context that most of the evidence or most of the research and the published literature to that point was coming from high-income countries, mainly from Europe and from the US. Well, North America, but mostly the US. But there was very little from low and middle income countries, which had led some people to believe that this was a Western condition and nobody else was concerned about it. It was a hidden. So I'm very pleased actually to see in the abstracts that are presented and going to be discussed here at this conference that there are contributions from Zambia, Mexico, Ukraine, Sudan, Nepal, Trinidad and Tobago and Kenya. So I think, the organisers should be congratulated for getting a more diverse representation of research that's going on. So, which of these challenges, what have we done about them? So, I'm going to stick with the first one, which is lack of consensus definition or nomenclature. This has not been sorted out. It really hasn't. 4 years on, we do not have a proper definition of long COVID that can be operationalised. Even in this conference, there are 45 abstracts. They use 6 different terms. They, as I've listed here, long COVID, post-acute sequelae of COVID, post-COVID condition, post-acute COVID, post-COVID-19, post-COVID syndrome. Those multiple things reflect the fact that we haven't agreed on what is inside and outside. For example, not understanding or no consensus on whether or not if someone has been ill with COVID-19 and they have a stroke, which is a known sequelae of severe COVID-19 infection, is that long COVID or is that's a stroke, so it doesn't fall in. We have to actually have more international consensus on what falls within long COVID. There is a tension here, and it's a real tension between the tendency in biological science for us to want to stratify and subdivide conditions into ever more precise categories. That's because we want to be able to identify mechanisms and identify effective treatments. And that's personalised medicine, precision medicine that we're all striving to practice. So we need precise strata and deep understanding of mechanism. But from the perspective of people who are suffering following COVID infection, they've actually been very keen to hold on to the collective term of long COVID, which they see they can advocate for, support for, and resources for by keeping it as a coherent group and not subdividing it into small groups. For many people now, long COVID remains a diagnosis of exclusion. It's actually in the WHO, not explained by anything else as part of the diagnosis, part of what the WHO defines it as. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are clinical here. A diagnosis of exclusion is really difficult for patients and for clinicians. And as the anthropologist Joseph Dumit has described, these are the illnesses you have to fight to get, which is things like chronic fatigue syndrome and ME and many other chronic conditions that are not well defined. I think that the lack of, the limitations in our biological understanding are very closely linked to this lack of a coherent definition or consistent definition. So 2 years ago, we identified the following possible mechanisms for long COVID: viral persistent or viral fragment persistence, abnormal immune responses of various kind, and microthrombi. There is further research actually supporting many of those. I'm not going to go into details of those. There's quite a few posters and presentations and a session tomorrow morning on these in this conference. And there are other mechanisms now that have been proposed and with some evidence, including reactivation of viruses such as Epstein-Barr virus, dysbiosis, and so on. So there are many potential mechanisms. Now, whether these are competing to be the same, competing reasons for long COVID, or actually these are all causes of post-COVID sequelae, I think the latter is more likely. That's something we're going to have to build up the evidence base for. We are also seeing, in addition to these, which have often been based on symptoms and clusters in the kind of way that the Recover study is looking at clustering people, using a data-driven way of clustering or using a clinical way of clustering. There are now also increasing studies starting to report using multiomics, whether it's using genomics, metabomics, etc., to try and uncover patterns that could lead to a common understanding of mechanism. And it will be interesting to hear some of the presentations at the conference on this. One question is how, I think I've talked a little bit about how whether we include things like stroke, but there's another question which is of interest to me, and was mentioned in the introduction that in the REACT study in England, in the UK, we are following up people. It's a population cohort. It was a randomly selected group of people who were tested during the first 2 years of the pandemic for virus, but also for antibodies. But we have got permission, and it's a consented cohort of 2.5 million, to follow them up to find out the health consequences. So it's a mixed group. Some have had infection, some have never had infection. The majority who've had infection have recovered quickly, but there is a group who have not recovered quickly and who we have said have persistent symptoms or long COVID. But interestingly, I think those kind of studies, they're quite rare to have population studies. There are some in other countries that have got registers of everybody who was tested, and some of them are being followed up. Because it's not just about people who have presented consciously with post-COVID syndromes, but we're starting to see from a lot of routine data and these big studies that there are increased risks of all kinds of abnormalities. SARS-CoV-2 affects multiple systems of the body, multiple organs, and actually we're seeing increased cardiovascular risk, even in people who didn't have severe COVID at the beginning. We're seeing reduced kidney function in people who've had infection compared with people who haven't had infection. Cognitive deficits, even in people who don't report brain fog and don't report severe infection, there's measurable cognitive defects. So we have to, in addition to studying people with clinically who consider that they have, or their clinicians consider they have long COVID, we also need to keep a close eye on what's going on in the general population, most of whom now, in most countries, I think, have had COVID at some point. So it's essential that we keep up that long-term surveillance. So just going back to the challenges and recommendations, one of them was that we needed to have large-scale multi-centre adaptive platform trials. Now, that's a big mouthful. During acute COVID, some of the large platform trials were really successful, enrolling large numbers of people with acute COVID over rapidly and testing multiple different interventions on those groups by having set this up. It was an emergency, if you like, an emergency response. That urgency has gone, and we haven't had those for long COVID, and I think that is one of the problems. There are a lot of trials. On the clinicaltrials.gov, there's over 400 trials for post-COVID conditions. Only 12 of those 400 are pharmacological. Most are behavioural, psychological, and exercise and other interventions. And there's an abstract at this conference, a systematic review of RCTs, that suggests there's only 23 trials, and actually they're at very high risk of bias. So I've covered sort of a range of things, and it's a bit depressing, to be honest. I mean, I think we have learnt a lot about some small things, but we haven't answered the big questions. So we need more research, particularly into the pathophysiology. But we can't allow the lack of our scientific progress to block care and support. And this is where I go back to what the patients have said. And I think we, as clinicians, researchers, whoever else is here, and the patients and advocates who I know are participating in the conference, we must work together to advocate for resources. I can't speak about all other countries, but I can talk about the UK. The UK has completely deprioritised COVID and long COVID research. Having invested initially in some quite big long COVID and post-COVID follow-up studies, it's now, well, you just compete with everything else. And we knew that from HIV, that does not work. You know, when you have a new disease, you actually need to really invest in it, and that is not happening. This, just want to say, this photo is from a video from Long COVID SOS called Message in a Bottle, and it was actually from July 2020. Lots of people holding up, I've had symptoms for 89 days or 100 and whatever days already, and describing what effect it was having on them. And they had 3 calls, if you like, at that time. So, you know, 3.5 years ago, for resources, research and recognition. And I think we're still in a situation where that's what we need. So thank you very much.